All right, one more day, one more escalation. And I want to start with the biggest one, because Friday night, close to midnight, Trump put out a statement that's genuinely different in kind from anything he's said so far in this cycle. Not the NATO press conference, not the ceasefire is over post from earlier that same day. This 1,000 missiles are locked and loaded and aimed at the Islamic Republic of Iran, with thousands of more to immediately follow, should the Iranian government act on its threat, pronounced in many corners of the globe, to assassinate or attempt to assassinate the sitting president of the United States of America, in this case, me. Orders have already been given, and the U.S. military is ready, willing, and able for a 1-year period of time, subject to extension, to completely decimate and destroy all areas of Iran. Now, that's a direct quote, word for word, capitalization and all, because I think the exact phrasing matters here more than almost anything else this week. I want to walk through what this statement actually says, what it doesn't say, and why the distinction matters, because a lot of coverage over the last 12 hours has jumped straight to talking about nuclear weapons. And I think that jump, while understandable given the scale of the language, isn't actually supported by the text itself. Trump says 1,000 missiles. He doesn't say warheads, he doesn't say nuclear, he doesn't reference any specific delivery platform beyond implying overwhelming force. Conventional cruise missile and ballistic missile stockpiles in the low thousands are well within the range of what the U.S. military can credibly claim to have ready across its submarine, air, and land platforms. So on its face, this is describing an enormous but conventional retaliatory strike posture, not necessarily a nuclear one. Could nuclear retaliation be implied by the phrase, decimate and destroy all areas of Iran for a full year? Maybe that phrase is doing a lot of ambiguous work. And I think that ambiguity is deliberate rather than accidental, the same way the ceasefire is over but we're still talking. Framing from Friday morning was deliberately ambiguous. A threat that's specific enough to sound credible but vague enough that it can't be pinned down to a single falsifiable claim is a more useful deterrent than a precise one, because it leaves the other side unable to calculate exactly what triggers what. What I don't want to do is state with confidence that Trump explicitly threatened nuclear war, because he didn't use that word, and adding it in for him, the way some of the more excitable coverage has done, is the kind of embellishment that actually weakens the credibility of everyone reporting on this story once people go back and check the primary source. The context behind the threat is well documented and genuinely serious on its own terms without needing embellishment. This follows directly from the assassination plot reporting we talked about yesterday. Israeli intelligence sharing word of what multiple outlets described as a specific, fresh Iranian plot, and it follows the funeral of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, where mourners in Tehran and Mashhad carried banners reading, "We will kill Trump," alongside banners threatening J.D. Vance, Pete Hegseth, and Benjamin Netanyahu by name. And on Friday, Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, who inherited the position after his father was killed in the February strikes, posted his own statement on social media, not audio, not video, a written post, pledging what he called vengeance, writing that the people responsible for his father's death, in his words, whose names are fully documented from the highest to the lowest ranks, will carry their dream of a peaceful death in bed to the grave. That's about as direct a threat as a head of state can make in writing, and it's worth being clear that it's real, it's sourced to his own verified account, and it's not something anyone had to embellish to make dramatic. Now, on the question of whether Mojtaba Khamenei is actually alive and personally issuing these statements, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of claim where speculation dressed up as analysis does real damage to how seriously people take the rest of the reporting. What's actually verifiable is this, reported independently by outlets like the Times of Israel, is that Khamenei's son has not been seen in public since the strike that killed his father back in February, and that every statement attributed to him since then has come through text or social media posts rather than audio or video appearances. That is a genuinely unusual pattern for a head of state making major public pronouncements during wartime, and it's fair to flag it as unusual. What it is not is proof of anything. There are entirely mundane explanations for a wartime leader avoiding public video appearances that have nothing to do with being dead, security concerns being the most obvious one, especially for a man whose father was killed by a precision strike, and who has just publicly promised revenge against the people who did it, which is not exactly the moment to be broadcasting your location on camera. So I'd put this in the category of a real, documented anomaly worth continuing to watch, not a conclusion, and I'd be skeptical of anyone telling you with confidence, in either direction, that they know for certain what's happening with him. Now let's talk about the fires, because there's a real problem with how this got covered yesterday and today that I want to correct directly. Multiple channels, including some of the bigger ones, have been reporting this as 2 separate major sabotage incidents in the span of 24 hours. A first mystery explosion, and then, quote, yet again, another factory up in flames, I went back and checked the location names and the timing carefully, and as far as I can tell from the confirmed reporting, these appear to be the same facility, described a day apart. The fire reported Friday at the Oxen Paliesh mini refinery near the town of Pol-e-Doktar in Lauriston province, and the fire being described today as a new incident near, in some of the phonetic transcriptions going around, Palkadar, appear to be referring to the identical location, just spelled and pronounced differently by different sources translating from Farsi. I could be wrong about this. It's genuinely possible there were two distinct incidents at two distinct facilities, and the reporting is just confusingly overlapping. But based on what I can verify, the responsible thing to do is flag that this may be the same event being recounted twice, rather than confidently telling you it's two separate sabotage operations. Because if it turns out to be one fire covered on a rolling news cycle, that changes the entire picture of how much confirmed unexplained industrial damage Iran has actually sustained this week. And I'd rather underclaim here and be corrected than overclaim and mislead you. What's not in dispute is that Iranian authorities themselves have said the fire was confined to a waste oil storage area at a small, roughly 5,000 barrel a day refinery, that it didn't spread to the main processing units, that there were no reported deaths or injuries, and that the actual cause is still listed as under investigation by local officials. Not confirmed sabotage, not confirmed accident. Now, the nuclear satellite story is where I think there's real, solid, independently verified reporting worth taking seriously, but again, the details matter more than the headline. This wasn't a single blurry claim. It was a joint investigation by CNN working with the Institute for Science and International Security using commercial satellite imagery captured between June and early July. What they actually found is reconstruction activity at two specific locations. Not Fordo, not Natanz, not Isfahan, the three big enrichment sites everybody associates with Iran's nuclear program, and the imagery specifically does not show visible reconstruction work at any of those three. What it does show is repair activity at a site called Taligan 2, inside the Parchin military complex southeast of Tehran, a location Western analysts have long associated not with uranium enrichment itself, but with nuclear weapons-related research, and the handling of explosive components, and separately, at a site sometimes called Pickaxe Mountain near Isfahan, a suspected underground facility where imagery showed vehicles moving in and out of tunnel entrances. Both of these are genuinely serious findings. Reconstruction at a site linked to weapons research, happening while a memorandum explicitly requiring Iran to maintain the status quo at its nuclear facilities was supposedly still in effect, is a real and legitimate story, and independent analysts quoted in that reporting are right to flag it as a possible breach of the spirit, if not the letter of the agreement. But it's a different and more specific story than simply saying Iran is rebuilding its nuke sites in general terms, and the distinction between weapons research infrastructure at Parchin versus enrichment infrastructure at the actual named facilities the world has spent years inspecting is the kind of distinction that determines how alarmed you should actually be, because those things carry very different implications for how close Iran might be to weapons-capable material versus simply protecting existing infrastructure or retrieving equipment, which is a possibility analysts also raised and which the satellite imagery alone genuinely cannot rule out. On the Strait of Hormuz itself, the numbers are worse than even the pessimistic framing in yesterday's coverage suggested, and this part I can back up with real granular data rather than a single anecdotal ship count. Maritime intelligence firms tracking the strait in real time have recorded daily transit numbers falling from the high 30s and low 40s earlier this month down to 35 vessels on July 7th, 17 on July 9th, and just 11 across all of July 10th. Against a pre-war baseline of roughly 130 vessels a day. Lloyd's List Intelligence separately reported that no large vessel above 10,000 deadweight tons transited the U.S. Coordinated southern route with its tracking transponder switched on at all since Tuesday, meaning the route Washington has been publicly insisting is safe has been functionally abandoned by big commercial shipping, while a meaningful share, close to half on some days, of the traffic that is still moving is doing so with its transponder, dark, untraceable. And Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, is reportedly in Oman right now, specifically to discuss Hormuz security. At the same time, the New York Times is reporting that the U.S. has told Iran it expects a public statement guaranteeing free passage through the strait within days, with officials warning bluntly that if that statement isn't followed by matching action, the result will not be, in their words, a good outcome for Iran. Language that reads as a fairly explicit threat of renewed and expanded strikes if Tehran doesn't comply. I'll be straightforwardly skeptical of that timeline the same way the competitor coverage on this was, because Iran has made verbal commitments to open passage multiple times already in this conflict, and the on-the-water numbers have not meaningfully followed. And there's no obvious reason for that pattern to suddenly break, just because Washington has set an informal deadline. There's also a genuinely strange wrinkle in who's actually been hitting Iran the last 2 days, because a round of strikes Thursday, right as the country was burying its former supreme leader, doesn't appear to have been formally claimed by anyone. The U.S. said its own strikes had already concluded the day before. Israel hasn't claimed it either, despite its defense minister saying the country is on alert and ready to strike again if needed. What multiple outlets are now reporting is that Iranian officials themselves are pointing fingers at the UAE, with a member of Iran's Parliamentary National Security Committee publicly warning that the Emirates would, in his words, pay the price for its cooperation with the United States. And one of Iran's deputy foreign ministers separately citing a new U.S. Commerce Department document that eased export control rules for the UAE, which he's framing as a reward for military support against Iran. Now, this accusation isn't coming out of nowhere. It has real history behind it. The UAE and Saudi Arabia have both previously been reported, including by the Wall Street Journal, as having launched their own unclaimed strikes on Iranian territory earlier in this war after Iran hit their own energy infrastructure. So the pattern Iran is alleging isn't implausible on its face. But I want to be honest that as of right now, nobody, not the U.S., not Israel, not the UAE, has actually claimed Thursday's strikes, which means what we have is an accusation with a plausible track record behind it, not a confirmed fact. And the honest position is to say clearly that we don't yet know who conducted those strikes, rather than repeating Iran's accusation as though it's been established. I also want to put this week's threat in the context of the pattern we've now seen build over several consecutive days, because I think looking at it as a sequence, rather than as one isolated post, tells you something the individual statements don't. Wednesday, at the NATO summit, Trump first raised the idea of his own death almost conversationally, listing it alongside the deaths of multiple Iranian leaders as though narrating the same casualty list. Friday morning, in the New York Post interview, he escalated to describing specific instructions he says he's left. To bomb Iran at levels never seen before, phrasing that's dramatic but still fairly abstract. And then Friday night, in the Truth Social post, the language became fully concrete for the first time, an actual number, 1,000 missiles, a specific time frame, 1 year subject to extension, and explicit confirmation that orders have already been given rather than merely contemplated. That's a genuine escalation ladder across roughly 48 hours, moving from a passing remark to a stated intention to a claimed operational order, and I think that progression is itself a form of communication, separate from whatever the literal content of each individual statement says. Whether or not any of this reflects an actual standing military order, and legal scholars have already raised real questions about whether a sitting president can meaningfully bind future military action in the event of his own death, given that command authority transfers immediately to his successor. The practical effect of building that ladder in public day by day is to make the threat land with more weight by the time it's fully spelled out than it would have if it had simply been stated cold on day one. That's a fairly sophisticated piece of coercive messaging if it's deliberate, and it's worth noticing regardless of whether you think Trump is doing it consciously as strategy or simply escalating in real time the way he often does when he feels personally threatened, because the effect on Tehran and on markets and on America's own regional partners watching all of this unfold is largely the same either way. There's a financial angle to all of this that connects directly to the sanctions fight from earlier in the week, and I think it actually explains part of why Tehran is reacting as sharply as it is right now. On Friday, the same day as the missile threat and the satellite story, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned a Dubai-based businessman named Ali Ansari, along with 7 other individuals and 5 companies, citing his financial links to the new supreme leader and to the Revolutionary Guard. Iran's own government has responded to this specific sanctions action by arguing it violates the memorandum both sides signed last month, since the agreement was supposed to include a period of economic relief running in parallel with the nuclear and shipping negotiations. So when you're evaluating the accusations flying in both directions this week about who broke the deal first and who's escalating unfairly, it's worth having the full financial picture in view rather than just the military one. Washington is pointing to the tanker attacks and the satellite evidence of reconstruction at Parchin as proof Iran isn't negotiating in good faith. Tehran is pointing to the oil license revocation from earlier in the week, and now this fresh sanctions action against a man tied directly to its new leadership as proof the U.S. isn't either. Both of those grievances are independently verifiable and both of them are real, which is exactly the kind of symmetrical, mutually reinforcing escalation pattern that makes a conflict like this so hard to actually walk back once it starts. Because neither side has to invent a grievance, they just have to keep pointing at the other's most recent move. I do want to address the evacuation flight claims directly, because I saw them covered pretty confidently in some of yesterday's videos on this topic, and I want to be honest with you about the actual evidentiary status of that story rather than just repeating it. The claims involve open-source flight tracking accounts identifying specific aircraft, a Russian-linked plane departing Shiraz without a filed destination, a Mahan air flight heading south out of Tehran, other aircraft appearing and disappearing from radar near sensitive military and nuclear-linked regions. I want to be clear that I was not able to independently verify these specific flight movements through any of the mainstream outlets I checked for this update, which doesn't mean they're false. Flight tracking communities have been reliable sources of real, later confirmed information at multiple points earlier in this war. But it does mean this particular claim currently sits in the category of unconfirmed open source reporting, rather than something backed by named officials or major wire services the way the sanctions, the missile threat, or the Hormuz transit numbers are. Planes take off from Iranian airports without public flight plans for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with an imminent new wave of strikes, cargo flights, personnel rotations, medical evacuations, routine diplomatic transport, and the honest position is that a handful of untraceable departures by itself is suggestive of nothing in particular until it's corroborated by something more concrete, whether that's satellite confirmation of military movement, an official statement, or a pattern that repeats and gets picked up by outlets with actual sourcing inside the region. If that corroboration shows up, I'll flag it directly in the next update, but for now, I'd hold that story more loosely than the framing it's gotten. Let's close with a piece of this that I think actually matters most for where prices and markets go from here, because underneath all of the individual dramatic headlines this week, there's a quieter structural story involving Saudi Arabia that's been running the whole time. Saudi Arabia has been one of the few actors in this entire conflict with a genuinely mixed set of incentives, because on one hand, it wants the war to end and stability to return. And on the other hand, the periods when Hormuz traffic has been constrained have pushed a meaningfully larger share of Gulf crude through Saudi Arabia's own overland pipeline to the Red Sea, the same east-west pipeline we talked about a few days ago that hit its full operating ceiling back in March. That pipeline gives Saudi Arabia a genuine hedge against exactly the kind of disruption we're watching play out in the Strait right now, one that its Emirati neighbors, still finishing their own larger bypass pipeline, don't yet have to nearly the same degree, and that gap has reportedly been sharpening old disagreements inside OPEC over production quotas, even as the two countries publicly present a unified front and coordinate closely with Washington on the diplomatic side. None of that means Saudi Arabia wants this war to continue. The kingdom has been actively involved in de-escalation efforts through the same Qatari and Omani channels, handling the Hormuz talks, but it does mean the country isn't purely a neutral bystander hoping for a fast resolution either. It's an actor whose own infrastructure investment has quietly shifted what a prolonged, contested strait actually costs it economically. And that's the kind of incentive that shapes how hard any single government actually pushes for a deal to close quickly versus how comfortable it can afford to be with the current uneasy, unresolved status quo continuing for a while longer. The rhetoric from Washington has jumped in a single day from the ceasefire is over to an explicit, if carefully worded, threat of massive retaliatory strikes tied directly to Trump's own physical safety, which tells you the assassination plot reporting from earlier in the week is being treated inside the administration as serious enough to build public deterrent messaging around, not just a one-off talking point. The nuclear story is real but narrower and more specific than the panic-inducing version circulating online, focused on a weapons research site and a suspected underground facility, not the major enrichment halls everyone has spent years watching. The industrial fire story may well be a single incident being recounted as two, which matters for how much confirmed sabotage activity you should actually believe is happening inside Iran right now versus how much is being amplified by repetition. The Strait of Hormuz numbers are genuinely as bad as they've been in weeks, with the U.S. favored southern route essentially abandoned by trackable shipping. And responsibility for Thursday's unclaimed strikes remains genuinely unresolved, with Iran pointing at the UAE using a real but circumstantial piece of evidence rather than anything approaching proof. None of that adds up to a clean, single narrative, and I think that's actually the most honest thing I can tell you about where this stands. What I'd watch for specifically over the next few days is whether Iran actually produces the public Hormuz statement the U.S. is reportedly demanding, and more importantly, whether the transit numbers on the southern route move at all in response. Because a statement without a change in the actual shipping data would tell you everything you need to know about how much weight to put on Iranian diplomatic language going forward. I'd watch whether any government, American, Israeli, or Emirati, ever claims Thursday's strikes. Because the longer that stays unclaimed, the more it starts to look like a deliberate ambiguity, similar to the ones we've talked about elsewhere in this conflict. And I'd watch whether Mojtaba Khamenei appears on camera or in audio at any point in the coming days, not because his absence proves anything on its own, but because if it continues for weeks longer without any real explanation, that's the kind of pattern that eventually does become genuinely significant, rather than just curious. I don't have clean answers on any of these threads tonight, and I think pretending otherwise would be doing you a disservice. What I can tell you is that the gap between the loudest headline of any given day this week and what's actually been independently verified keeps turning out to be the most important part of the story. And that's exactly where I'll keep looking as this develops.